Hello and good evening, I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan.
You're watching Consider This. Recently, the federal court, in a majority ruling, said that the National Registration Department, or the NRD, was wrong to decide on its own to use bin Abdullah for a Johor-born illegitimate Muslim child's name in his birth certificate. However, the federal court also said that the NRD was right to disallow the father's name to be part of the boy's name. Now, this was a majority decision with 4 of the 7 judges on the federal court panel for this case. The boy was born in 2009, but his birth was only registered 2 years later, and because he was born less than 6 months after the parents' marriage, that is considered illegitimate under Sharia law. Here to discuss the case a little bit further, we have Nizam Bashir, who was a lawyer representing the parents and the child in the bin Abdullah case. Nizam, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
All right, so I think I just want to get your perspective, or help us set the scene in terms of the recent ruling from the federal court. What was the significance of this allowing and then disallowing?
Well, I think perhaps it's best to firstly identify what was referred to the federal court for them to decide. Now, there were 3 questions that were referred to the federal court. Now, the first question was whether a particular section of the Births, Deaths Registration Act applies to the registration of births of Malay-Muslim children. So that was the first question. Then the other question was whether the Registrar of Births may refer and rely on sources of Islamic law on legitimacy. And finally, whether the civil court can determine questions or matters of legitimacy of Muslim children in respect of naming and ascription of paternity. Now, the federal court did not answer all the questions. They only answered 2 out of 3. And vis-a-vis the first question, the federal court ruled that Section 13 of the Births, Deaths Registration Act, which deals with surnames, do not apply to registration of births of Malay-Muslim children, as Malays do not have surnames. Okay, that's the broad position that the federal court arrived at. And vis-a-vis the second question, in performing registration of births of Muslim children, the Director General of the National Registration Department may refer to and rely on sources of Islamic law on legitimacy, but it has to be done in a lawful manner. So vis-a-vis the second question, the court did not agree that the registrar in question exercised his powers in a lawful manner. And the reason for that was because the child in question, it comes from Johor, and Johor does not have any state fatwa on the matter regulating the issue of naming of Muslim illegitimate children. So when the registrar was dealing with the application, he looked at the National Fatwa Committee's fatwa on the matter, which was never gazetted in Johor, and made a ruling that based on that, the child had to be bin Abdullah and could not be given a name bin the father's name.
Right.
I want to ask you, I mean, this is the kind of like stepping back from, you know, what seems to be a legal thicket of, you know, of fatwas and laws and reasons and, you know, and solid reasons for having those laws. I do want to ask this question, though, you know, whether at the end of the day, a child is named in order to signal who they belong to in a family sense, right? Sure. We know that there's no dispute about mothers.
Sure.
So legitimacy comes from, if legitimacy came from your mother, there'd be no problem.
Sure.
Right? So what is at stake here? And what should the public at least focus on when thinking about this issue? What is at stake here? Is this about private morality, or is it about the interests of the child?
I think on the one hand, there is a right to identity that is at stake, because as you rightly noted, at the end of the day, when you're talking about children, you're talking about family, it's a sense of identification with the family. And of course, you know, if there's only one child, it's not so problematic. But when you have more than one child, for example, the first child may be illegitimate, the second child may not be. And the second child has got a bin with the father's name, the first child doesn't. And the first child, maybe it's bin Abdullah, or maybe totally no bin, as perhaps has happened here. So that causes a problem. And I can be very candid in terms of the facts of, or in my client's case, he opted not to have a second child. for that very reason, because he didn't know how to explain to his child, if he had another child, that there was a different bin there.
That's an extraordinary sacrifice family to make.
Can I just come back to your initial answer, Nizam, and get you to clarify? So you mentioned that because he is Johor born, there's no fatwa that's been gazetted under this. Explain to me the role of the fatwa in determining the legitimacy of a child in the different states.
Yeah, I think if we were to look at the Birth That's Registration Act in the first place, there is no framework for that really, for the registrar to sort of look at other sources to determine naming rights. So if we were to look at the Act alone, as long as the name doesn't confer an objectionable meaning, an offensive meaning, the registrar is duty bound to register the name. So what has happened here, I suppose they sort of the registrar opted to look at things beyond perhaps the parameters of the Act, and that was why one of the questions was whether he could do that. And the court took the view in answering the question that he could do that, to look at Islamic law on matters of naming to determine that question as to whether or not the child could be named with the bin of the father's name.
Right.
Well, I want to ask you about, okay, just again, a very broad question, but Muslims and non-Muslims in this country, and the non-Muslim category, because it's a huge array of diversity. A lot of Indians don't have surnames like Malay Muslims too, and we know some Malay Muslims actually do have surnames. So is this a question that's a problem peculiar to the Muslim community of Malaysia? Or do non-Muslims ever get caught up in this question of legitimacy, which is a universal issue? Paternity is a universal one. Or is it just a peculiarly Malay-Muslim problem?
Well, if we were to look at Section 13A, which addresses the question of naming of illegitimate children, Section 13A provides a mechanism to overcome this issue. So long as the father consents to it, there's a joint application between the father and mother, the child can be given the surname of the father.
Right, the father here, we mean somebody who's married to the mother, not necessarily the biological father. Would that be correct? Is there a need to establish the biological link between father and child?
I'm just going to look at the provisions of Section 13A. I don't think there's any restriction in that sense. As long as someone is prepared to come forward and say that, look, I'm the father of that child, that's the end of the matter.
Right.
Okay? And I think the registrar should not make any further inquiries. I think Section 13A is merciful in that sense, and I think we should maintain that approach, because at the end of the day, what are we trying to encourage? If individuals are prepared to come forward, be responsible for a child, for a family, shouldn't that be something that we encourage?
Right.
I think it's so simple.
All right, we're going to take a quick break and continue this conversation, particularly pick up on that point.
Sure.
Stay tuned to consider this. Don't go anywhere.